Hello, my name is Eric. I'm a software engineer. I found oftentimes when using a new library or trying to fix a bug, I skim the documentation. I'm guilty. I'll speed read or I'll search just to find out one piece of information that's going to help me do whatever it is I'm doing and move on to the next step. But I don't like that. In this video series, I'm challenging myself to slow down, break down coding examples, and really deep dive into documentation that folks have spent a lot of time and energy on so that people like me, and probably you, can utilize their library to its fullest extent. Welcome to Documentation Nation. Hello, Documentation Nation. We are going to be looking at the new React documentation today, still in beta, according to the URL here. I believe I mentioned on a previous stream or video somewhere that I was a little frustrated with the React documentation because it was still using class components versus functional components. So this is the update. It's been out for a little while. I don't remember specifically when it came out, but haven't really looked through any of this. And we'll be doing what we can today to just go through something a little bit familiar. I'm going to go through useState documentation here. I've used React for a lot of my projects. I really enjoy coding with React, and I'm very familiar with useState. It's everywhere. So let's go through the documentation and let's take a look here and just go through some of the exercises that are given, or just play around with it and see how we go through this. So I'm not going to go through installation, but I believe there's two sections in here. There's a quick start section, which we can go through, which has some creating components, nesting components, which I'm not going to do specifically. There's a state section in quick start, but I don't know that we should do that because I don't really want this to be the quick start thing, right? Like, we've got using hooks, we've got sharing data between components, we've got state in here. But when we go to managing state really is what I'm interested in tackling, the more in-depth stuff, which is listed as an intermediate. I'm not sure what their rating system is here. Right here, we've already got kind of the hint that state isn't to be duplicated within our application. So we're going to learn about how to think about UI changes, how to structure state, how to lift state up, and control whether state gets preserved or reset, consolidate complex state, logic in a function, how to pass information without prop drilling, which is super important, right? I kind of get lost in that myself, where I do excessive prop drilling and trying to get better at that. How to scale state management as your app grows. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, in this sheet, I'm going to install React here. We're going to make a new, I'm in a folder, I'm going to make a new file here, or the whole setup, right? And I'm going to not use create React app. I'm going to use Vite. Latest. Let's call this use state docs, and let's use React. And the documentation doesn't use TypeScript, but I'm going to use TypeScript, just trying to keep myself in the habit of using it. All right. Let's start here. With React, you won't modify the UI from code directly. For example, you won't write commands like disable the button, enable the button, show the success message. Instead, you will describe the UI you want to see for the different visual states of your component: initial state, typing state, success state, and then trigger the state changes in response to user input. This is similar to how designers think about UI. There's a quiz form built using React to note how it uses the status state variable to determine whether to enable or disable the submit button and whether to show the success message instead. So I've got my source over here. Let's go to just app.tsx, and we can also get this running right now. And I'm going to end up just clearing out a bunch of this starter code. And here we go. We've got our basic counter stuff in here, and then we're just gonna, we'll just pop out. Right now I'll keep this app container, but I'm gonna get rid of everything else. So here we've got a quiz in the documentation here. We see their import useState from React, where they export the functional component. We got 3 different state here, 3 different useState commands. So we've got answer and set answer, error, set error. It's just a quiz. So in which city is there a billboard that turns air into drinkable water? And then whatever we type in here, we're going to get wrong. But good guess, but a wrong answer. Try again, right? So let's look at the JSX first, right? We've got the whole thing returns. There's our H2, the city quiz. Here's our paragraph with the question. And then they wrap this in a form, right? Your text area and your submit button. We can see they tie value of the text area to the state of answer. We can see they have an on change that calls the function handle text area change. And then they have disabled equals status triple equals submitting in quotes there, right? So let's go, and they've got on the whole form, they've got an on submit for when you click that submit button, right? Which is working because they have this button. Can I scroll anymore? They have this button wrapped in those form tags. The button's disabled here, right? If answer.length, which is our value answer, is tied to whatever this form value is, or this text area value is. So if that's equal to 0, or if status is equal to submitting, right? We're going to see what changes that status in a minute. And then they've got some error stuff here. So let's go look at the functions that are written, right? Here's handle text area change, which passes in an event, right? Which we look at the text area, the on change, handle text area change. So they're passing in an event here, and then set answer, which is part of their useState for answer, right? It's their setter function. They're just passing in e.target.value. So whatever the value is of what we're typing in that field. So if we look at the actual handle submit, they're ePrevent default, right? You know, if we have something wrapped in a form and we hit a submit button, it's going to send out that request and it's going to refresh that page. So we don't want that to happen. Set status to submitting. So that's where that submitting comes in, right? As soon as you click that button, status, which defaults as typing, they're just changing to the string of submitting. See, as soon as and status is disabled, right? If you know, this is gonna equal out to true, right? This JavaScript status triple equals to submitting. Once that equals submitting, when we initialize that function, that's gonna equal true, right? So let's see how that looks. We're typing whatever, right? We can still submit. As I click submit, you see all this grays out, right? That's on text area and the button itself. So as it's submitting, when we click that function, it changes to submitting, and then they wrap this in a try catch, where there are await submit form answer, and if it comes back correct, then we get a success, set status to success. Otherwise, we get an error, which is this down here that's displaying set status is set back to typing. They set error to whatever that error is that they're receiving. So we don't get to see the submit form function, right? Which is just, I guess, oh, no, here it is, actually, towards the bottom. So here's the submit form function that we saw, which takes our answer, which is the state we have here. Turns the new promise. There's a timeout. So this isn't actually calling out anywhere, right? This is just kind of simulating what could be a call out to a server somewhere. Well, we can see that, you know, let should error equals answer to lowercase. If it doesn't equal Lima, then we reject with this, right? So if I type in Lima here, now it should give me a positive affirmation here. That's right. Cool. So that's how all that's working, which is fun. And here's our timeout in milliseconds. So it's just taking 1500 milliseconds before it actually returns that promise, and they take that promise and they, within their try catch, And if it's success, then they throw that success in there for us, and they give us back our, let's go look at what everything should be with the success. Where does that's right come into play here? So here's the that's right message, right? So this whole thing then, this is a different return statement, right? So in their use case here, in their example, if status comes back with success, which is what we saw down below, in the case that our value matched, our answer matched Lima, then we have a return statement here, which just is an H1 that says that's right. So that if statement is just being passed over from the beginning, right? Because that status is set to typing until we get that positive answer, until we get the correct answer back. And then in that, in this try catch, it's being set as a success. And then we hit this statement, right? And then this return isn't even hit because we can only have one return of this functional component. So you're either going to have this return, which is just the H1, or you're going to have the return statement with all this JSX in here. So cool. All right. We've taken a look at that. We understand the code that's there. We've read through the code that's there. We looked through all those functions, and it's all making sense to me. I don't know if they expect a newcomer to this to read through this and fully realize what all this is doing, but it all makes sense, and it's a pretty good example of how to use useState on a number of different things here. It's a pretty clever example. Choosing the state structure. Structuring state well can make a difference between a component that is pleasant to modify and debug and one that is a constant source of bugs. The most important principle is that a state shouldn't contain redundant or duplicated information. If there's some unnecessary state, it's easy to forget to update it and introduce bugs. For example, this form has a redundant full name state variable. I'm not coding anything yet. I wonder if I should make this full screen. You know what? It might be better to do than scrolling up and down through this. I think it's going to be a little better if let's copy all this stuff, right? Or let's start typing out some code, right? So we know when we're using React, it's not explicitly stated here in the documentation, but we should have inferred by this point that we need to import useState from React before we can actually do what they're describing here. Let's put in our useState, right? We're going to do const. They've got here first name set first name equals useState, starting off as a blank string. They've got 3 of these things. Last name. Oh, I see. So we're going to type some of this stuff out, right, just to kind of see the example here of redundancy. And actually, this is a thing that I definitely did when learning React the first time around, and handling forms and things like that. So we've got set last name, and then they've got full name and set full name. And we can see each one of these is starting as a blank string. That's our initial state value. And they've got a function here, which we'll go back to in a minute to handle all these changes, right? I don't want to just type this out bottom to top. I want to explore this code a little bit more. Here's a return statement. I can copy this. I don't need to type every single one of these things out, but we've got, well, let's copy the return statement and let's take a look at it in our code here in our editor. So we've got, well, I don't need this. Oh, no, I don't need this fragment because I've already got a container. So we've got some errors here because I didn't set up those functions yet, and that's okay. Let's get rid of this. Let's give this some room to breathe. Let's word wrap this thing. So in here, we've just got an H2, let's check you in. And then we've got a label with an input, right? So they're wrapping their label around their input. You might see this, you know, with the HTML4 in the label and these things separate. It's cool to do it this way. with a value tied to the first name state and a value tied to the last name state, and then a paragraph with your ticket be issued to full name, right? So now let's go look at the actual functions they've got here, right? Right, they've got function handle first name change E. Let's type that incorrectly. First name change E, which is our event, which we can look at. Let's do that first. And we'll do the last name change. We'll just do the same exact thing. Oops, handle last name change. Right? And here's our form. The formatting's totally different. I don't care right now. That's fine. And let's look at what's going on here, right? So we've got our first name and last name fields. They are blank at the moment. We are starting off with a blank state. If I were to have put something in here, like our first name, if it has the value of test to begin with, that's going to show up, right? Because we've got our value is tied to the state of first name. If it isn't tied to the state of first name, let me refresh this now. We've got nothing in here, right? So when you've got your forms, you need to make sure that your value, you have a value listed that is tied to whatever your state of that particular input field is going to be. So we'll drop that back down to a blank value. Same thing with last name. And then your ticket will be issued to full name, which is over here, which we've got nothing showing yet because we don't have a value for full name, right? And we do have this on change function, which calls our handle first name change function. And as soon as we start typing in here, now we can see here's our event, which has all sorts of fun stuff in it. And what they are calling is e.target.value, right? So if we look down here, we've got target, which is our input, because this is the event that's happening on this input. And here's our value. Like we could see they have set first name as e.target.value. Set first name e.target.value, right? So anything that comes through as that value is going to update with our setter function. So now if I want to reset this because I want to look at this again with our log that we call in, right? So we've got target and I want to call attention to this now, right? So now we see the E in there because we've tied our value, we've got our setter function. And every time we call that update, I'm going to drop this down to e.target.value so we can just really see what's going on here, right? So every time we type in something, that value changes, e.target.value, and it's going to our setter function. Cool. And let's close that so I don't get confused. And then they're doing set full name. So you can see they're doing set full name twice in both of these things. e.target.value, and we add to last name, e.target.value, we add into first name. And as we type, then both of those things are going to update, right? So let's just copy this over and save ourselves some typing. Same thing with this. Actually, I'll call both of these because I haven't updated that yet. So now as we go through here, I don't really need my console anymore. I'm not logging anything. And we can see as we type, Mr. David gets his name appeared below. But this is a bad example of managing state, right? And this is what this is going to tell us. So you can remove it and simplify the code by calculating full name while the component is rendering. So what is this saying for us? This is just giving us, instead of full name as a state, it's giving us full name just as a value, right? And the reason that this is going to work for us is, and let's see what, does it tell us? It doesn't tell us here. So I was looking through the documentation here to try to find a specific call out to why they're recommending managing state this way, right? Or you know, getting rid of the set full name and getting rid of that state completely and just using a const value. right? Using a constant, which, you know, makes sense, right? This is the way this should be handled, because you don't need a state for full name when you can calculate full name based on first name, last name. So let's get rid of that, right? And let's, you know, we see that this is going to work the same way. If I do David again, we see that it's working the same way. But I don't really see a good explicit explanation on the why, which is all about re-rendering, right? When you have a component in React and the state changes, we have a state changing, it re-renders that component. Let's do a little display on this, right? So if we just kind of console.log, you know, I have rendered, and we inspect this. This isn't in a function, right? This is just, I just have this as a console.log statement, right, in our functional component. So let's clear this out. Let's refresh. We see we get I have rendered. I'm getting a duplicate here because of React strict, I think, is on. Let's go adjust that real quick because I don't want that. Let's get rid of strict mode so we only see this one time. Okay, so our component loads, we get I have rendered. I type a D, we have I have rendered. I type A, V, I, D. We're seeing multiple console.logs here, right? Every time I type in a letter, we're setting state, and React is re-rendering the entire component. If you have one tiny little box of a component that we're rendering, you don't need to re-render the entire page, so you can update, you know, your UI way more with way more specificity, right? And we can show this. Let's make a test input.tsx component, and we can set our state here like we did in the other. We can do const test state and set test state equals use state, and we'll do the same thing as a blank string. Our value here is going to be tied to our state, right? And then on change, I'm not going to write out a separate function for this. I'm just going to do we send e over to set test state e.target.value. I didn't throw an equal sign in there. Here we go. And if I import this into our React component here, import test input, and we can just throw this right down at the bottom here. Test input, right? So this one has its own state. And let's do the same thing here. Let's do a console.log test input render. And over here, we'll change this to parent app render, right? And let's go look at the logs here. So let's clear out everything that's here and let's refresh. So we've got parent app render and test input render, right? As both of these things appear for the first time. Each time I update now the entire thing, we get both parent app and test input render, right? Because that test input is a child component of our parent, right? So everything is re-rendering every time we have a state update. But if I just, this is our test input, this is this input down here. So now if I just make an update here, now we're just seeing test input render. That's the only thing now that is re-rendering, right? So I'm missing that from within this documentation here, right? Where it says, where we've got this lesson of, we don't need state for this thing. We can just calculate it and it's going to update because of the re-render process. It says that, you can remove it and simplify the code by calculating full name while the component is rendering, which is true, but it doesn't really explicitly state how rendering works here or linked out to something else that explains it, which might be helpful for some folks who are new to the framework. But there you go. Hopefully that was helpful in understanding why they're suggesting that we do that. Sharing state between components. Sometimes you want the state of two components to always change together. To do it, remove state from both of them, move it to their closest common parent, and then pass it down to them via props. This is known as lifting state up, and it's one of the most common things you will do writing React code. In this example, only one panel should be active at a time. To achieve this, instead of keeping the active state inside each individual panel, the parent component holds a state and specifies the props for its children. So here's the state that they've got. They've got active index, set active index, which defaults to 0. And in their return statement is all of this fun stuff that we're going to look at in a second. And I copied that last bracket. All right, let's get rid of this. So here's what they've got here, right? And if we're looking through this thing, we've got our H2. We've got panel here, title about is active. Active index is equal to 0. A little bit confusing way using active index and set active index, right? When I'm thinking index, I'm thinking these things are in an array of some kind, but that's not necessarily the case, right? You can set this up however it makes sense to you, but what's going on here is we've got the panel, right? This is the panel function. This is the child. This is the parent that we've got up here. And these are the props that are being passed in. This is giving me all these errors because I'm using TypeScript. I guess I probably shouldn't in this case, but I'm not declaring what any of these things are. So let's look at function panel first, right? This is a component on its own. This is our return statement, which are breaking this out into section, which is fine. Class name is panel. Don't really care about that. H3, which is the title prop we're passing in. Then there's is active and ternary operator here. And if it is active, if that's true, then children is displayed in paragraph. And then there's a button. If it's not active, right? This is the opposing if else kind of statement here, right? If active is true, is active true, then display in paragraph the children. Otherwise, display a button that has an on click of show, which the button says show. This is our button. And the on click command, what does that do for us? Calls an anonymous function, which sets the active index on this particular one to 0, and on this other panel component, on show calls an anonymous function that sets the active index to 1. So if I click on this is the about section that isn't showing right now. Clicking on this button, calls set active index and updates that state to 1, or to 0 in that case, sorry. This show button sets that active index to 1. Is active is passed in, and this is only going to be true if active index is equal to 1, right? So we've got two. I'm going to separate this out a little bit more to really see what's going on here. Because panel isn't something that you're typically seeing, right, in regular HTML. Panel, we're using panel because this is the component, right? So let's build this out, and let's add another panel in here and really see what's going on. So we've got panel. Let's make our own panel. And we've got a couple things here that are being passed through as props to panel. All right, we've got title, which we're going to call this our test panel. We've got is active, which is just a prop that we're passing through. We've got active index. We're going to set this, for our case, we're going to set this to 2. right? They've already got 0, they've already got 1. You could call this anything, not index, right? You don't need to call this, you could just call this active number if you really wanted to. It's got an on show prop, which is just the function that we're passing in, right? We call an anonymous function. We call our setter active index. And in our case, this one's going to be 2, right? Oops, for some reason my on show came out. Let's put that actually in. Make sure that's in as a prop, right? And we've got our test panel down here, right? Which we don't need to send in the button, right? That button's already there for our test panel because that's part of this component right here. And this is the ternary operator that's saying like, okay, active index is yet to be set to 2. So don't display children. And children here is literally just this stuff that's in between our two panels, right? That's inside of our panel component here that we're listing out this way, right? So here's children. Here's the text. Whatever we list here is considered children, right? When you've got your opening and closing brackets on your components, anything inside is children and can be passed through as a prop, right? Rather than making this a children prop, which you might also be doing, this is the alternative, right? Rather than using that, just listing our children prop in between is a little bit cleaner, a little bit nicer to read. So now if I click this, because our on click is already being set here, right? On show, we've got our on show function that's being passed in. So now we've got this here, whatever we list here is considered our children, and we've set that. So we're reading that example, we're understanding how that works. A little bit of separation helped us kind of visualize this a little bit better. And this is another thing that, I don't know that, it's really just talking about state being set at an upper level. It's not diving in here to how this is working. So I'm happy that I'm going through this and kind of diving and digesting this a little bit better, helping me, get better at the process of reading code and understanding code and becoming familiar with a different code base that isn't my own. Granted, this is a very small example, but we're able to talk through it and learn a couple things. Preserving and resetting state. When you re-render a component, React needs to decide which parts of the tree to keep and update, and which parts to discard or recreate from scratch. In most cases, React's automatic behavior works well enough. By default, React preserves the parts of the tree that match up with the previously rendered component tree. However, sometimes this is not what you want. For example, in this app, typing a message and then switching the recipient does not reset the input. This can make the user accidentally send a message to the wrong person. In this example, it's saying that if we type something in here and then we switch, that state is not being reset. So React lets you override the default behavior and force a component to reset its state by passing in a different key, like chat key equals email. This tells React that if the recipient is different, it should be considered a different chat component that needs to be recreated from scratch with new data and UI-like inputs. Now switching between recipient always resets the input field even though you render the same component. So let's see what's going on with this one now. So here we've got chat with key is tied to this state, right? As opposed to before, doesn't have a key at all. Normally you're going to use keys when you've got, you're mapping through data, right? Which is what's happening over here on the contact list.js file, context.map, right? This needs a key. So React can kind of keep track of what each of those components are. So in this, what they're doing is they're assigning a key to a component that's not being mapped, that otherwise wouldn't be re-rendered when we change state here. This contacts, when we look, here's our contacts, right? And we can see it's an array. and contacts is set to the default of 0, right? An array 0, so index 0. So this is our default Taylor with email Taylor. So the chat, the key is set to whatever our to value is, dot email, dot notation email. So in the case of Taylor, it's set to email Taylor. And if we type something in, and now I click on Alice, now it's re-rendering this whole component where otherwise it wasn't doing that previously. So that's a cool thing to know. You can force a reset, you know, because now in our chat.js, that state is going to reset back to whatever your default value is. Otherwise, that's going to retain state because previously this wasn't going to re-render, right? And that's pretty cool. We're going to stop here for now. Hopefully this was fun to follow along with, and it's been nice for me to just dive into documentation. See you for the next one.